The fluorescent lights in Dr. Martinez's office seemed brighter than usual that Tuesday morning in October 2015. I sat across from her mahogany desk, my hands trembling slightly as she reviewed my test results with the careful precision of someone delivering life-altering news. The silence stretched between us like a canyon, and I could hear my heart pounding in my ears like a drum echoing in an empty cathedral. When she finally looked up, her eyes carried the weight of words she didn't want to say, the kind of burden that comes with being the messenger of fate. "Marcus," she began softly, her voice barely above a whisper, "your HIV test came back positive." The room spun around me like a carnival ride gone wrong, and suddenly the air felt too thin to breathe, as if all the oxygen had been sucked out of the space between us. Those 4 words shattered my world into a million pieces, each fragment reflecting a different fear I had never allowed myself to contemplate. At 28 years old, I thought I had my entire life mapped out with the confidence of youth and privilege. My marketing career was flourishing in ways I had only dreamed of. I had just moved in with my boyfriend David after a year of dating, and we were excitedly planning our future together with the naive optimism of people who believed love could conquer anything. HIV was something that happened to other people in documentaries and news stories, not to someone like me who got regular checkups and considered himself careful about his health and relationships. The irony wasn't lost on me that I had gone in for what I thought was a routine screening after David suggested we both get tested before our romantic vacation to Europe, a trip we had been planning for months. Dr. Martinez continued speaking about treatment options and survival rates, but her words became a distant hum as my mind raced through 1,000 catastrophic thoughts like a runaway train. Would David still love me when he found out, or would this revelation destroy the best relationship I had ever experienced? Would I die young like the tragic stories I'd heard growing up in the 1990s, when HIV was still considered a death sentence? How would I tell my conservative parents back in Columbus, Ohio, who had already struggled to accept my sexuality and might see this as some kind of divine punishment? The shame burned in my chest like acid, mixing with terror and disbelief in a cocktail of emotions I had never experienced before. I had always been the responsible one in my family, the good son who made smart choices, the reliable friend everyone could count on, and this diagnosis felt like evidence that I had somehow failed at being the person I thought I was. The doctor handed me a stack of pamphlets about treatment options and support groups, their glossy covers promising hope and normalcy that felt impossible to imagine in that moment. Her voice became clearer as she explained that HIV wasn't the death sentence it once was, that people with the virus could live full, normal lives with proper medication and care, citing statistics and success stories with the practiced ease of someone who had delivered this speech many times before. But those words felt hollow and meaningless as they bounced around the sterile room, unable to penetrate the fog of panic that had settled over my thoughts. All I could think about was how everything I had worked for, everything I had dreamed of and built and hoped for, might now be tainted by these 3 letters that would follow me forever like shadows. The future I had imagined with David, marriage, maybe adoption, growing old together, suddenly felt like a fantasy that belonged to someone else, someone who didn't carry this virus in his bloodstream. I left the clinic in a daze, walking past the reception desk where other patients waited for their own appointments, blissfully unaware of the bomb that had just exploded in my life. The October wind cut through my jacket as I walked aimlessly through downtown Portland, the city's familiar streets suddenly feeling foreign and hostile under the gray Pacific Northwest sky. The city continued its rhythm around me with oblivious normalcy, people rushing to work with coffee cups in hand, street vendors calling out their daily specials, traffic humming along the busy streets in the eternal dance of urban life. But I felt disconnected from it all, like I was watching life through thick glass or experiencing everything from underwater, separated from the world of healthy people who didn't have to think about viral loads and medication schedules. Every person I passed seemed to represent the divide between before and after, between the Marcus who had woken up that morning thinking about weekend plans and the Marcus who now had to figure out how to live with HIV. That night, I sat in my apartment staring at my phone with David's contact information glowing on the screen, unable to find the courage to call him or my family with news that would change everything. The weight of the secret felt impossibly heavy, like carrying a boulder that grew larger with each passing hour of silence. Instead, I found myself remembering fragments of my life with the strange clarity that comes with crisis, wondering if there were signs I had missed along the way, moments that led to this crossroads that now seemed inevitable in retrospect. As the city lights twinkled outside my window like stars in an urban constellation, I realized that to understand where I was going, I needed to revisit where I had been and how I had become the person sitting in this chair, facing this diagnosis. My journey with HIV was just beginning, but my story, the real story of who I was beneath the fear and shame, started long before that Tuesday morning in Dr. Martinez's office, in a small house in Columbus where a boy named Marcus Thompson first learned to dream.
We tell emotional and inspiring stories about life's toughest battles, moments of illness, struggle, recovery, love, and loss. Not every story has a happy ending, but each one carries a powerful message of strength, hope, and humanity. Subscribe to discover moving stories that touch the heart and stay with you forever.
Growing up in Columbus, Ohio in the 1990s, I was the quintessential middle child in a family that valued tradition, stability, and conformity above all else. My father, Robert Thompson, managed the largest hardware store in our suburban neighborhood, a job that required him to know everything about fixing things that were broken, while my mother, Susan, taught second grade at Lincoln Elementary School just 3 blocks from our modest ranch house on Maple Street. My older sister Emma was the academic star who brought home straight A's and science fair ribbons, and my younger brother Jake was the natural athlete who could throw a perfect spiral by age 7 and had coaches already talking about high school football scholarships. I found my place as the creative one, the kid who spent hours at the kitchen table drawing elaborate comic book characters and writing stories about space adventures that took place in galaxies far from suburban Ohio. Our house on Maple Street was filled with the comfortable chaos of suburban family life that defined middle-class America in the decade before the internet changed everything. Saturday mornings meant pancakes shaped like Mickey Mouse heads while we watched cartoons in our pajamas. Sunday afternoons were reserved for marathon board game sessions that sometimes lasted until dinner, and summer evenings found us catching fireflies in mason jars while the ice cream truck played its tinkling melody through the neighborhood. Mom would read to us every night before bed, her voice bringing fairy tales and adventure stories to life in the bedroom I shared with Jake, complete with bunk beds and glow-in-the-dark stars stuck to the ceiling. Dad taught me how to throw a baseball in the backyard every evening after work, even though my heart wasn't really in sports and we both knew I'd rather be inside writing stories or drawing pictures. These were the golden days when my biggest worry was whether I'd get picked for kickball at recess and whether Mom would pack my favorite peanut butter and jelly sandwich in my lunchbox. I was probably 8 years old when I first realized I was fundamentally different from the other boys in my class, though I lacked the vocabulary to understand what that difference meant. While my classmates talked excitedly about which girls they had crushes on and who they wanted to ask to be their girlfriend, I found myself drawn to watching other boys instead, fascinated by the way they moved and talked and laughed together. The feeling was confusing and frightening in a way I couldn't articulate to anyone, especially not to myself, like having a secret that I didn't even understand. In our conservative household, where grace was said before every meal and church attendance every Sunday was as mandatory as brushing your teeth, these thoughts felt wrong and dangerous in a way that made my stomach hurt. I pushed them down deep into a place where I kept all the things that scared me, convincing myself it was just a phase that would pass with time like chicken pox or losing baby teeth. School became simultaneously my sanctuary and my greatest challenge, a place where I could excel in some areas while struggling desperately in others. I was a star in English class and art period, but math and science might as well have been taught in a foreign language for all the sense they made to me. Mrs. Patterson, my 4th grade teacher who wore colorful scarves and always smelled like vanilla perfume, recognized my creative talents early and encouraged me to enter the district writing competition with a story I had written about a lonely boy who discovered he could communicate with animals. When I won first place and got to read my story at an assembly in front of the entire school, I felt the first real taste of accomplishment that belonged entirely to me, separate from my family's expectations or my siblings' achievements. That blue ribbon hung on my bedroom wall for years, a daily reminder that I had something special to offer the world, even if I wasn't sure what that something was or how to develop it further. The summers of my childhood blur together in a golden montage of bicycle rides to the public pool where I spent hours in the chlorinated water, cherry popsicles that stained my lips bright red and dripped down my arms in sticky streams, and the intoxicating freedom that came with 3 months away from homework and social pressures. Emma would often take Jake and me to the Carnegie Library downtown, a massive brick building with marble floors and tall windows that made everything feel important and sacred, where I discovered entire worlds within the pages of books that transported me far from suburban Ohio. Science fiction became my preferred escape route. Stories of distant planets and alien civilizations where being different wasn't just accepted but celebrated as a valuable trait. Authors like Ray Bradbury and Isaac Asimov showed me that imagination could be a superpower, that the weird kids who spent their time thinking about impossible things sometimes grew up to change the world in ways that popular kids never could. As I approached middle school and the end of childhood's protective bubble, the innocence of those early years began to fade around the edges like a photograph left in the sun. I started noticing that other kids seemed to have received an instruction manual for growing up that I had somehow missed or lost, a guidebook that explained how to be cool and confident and comfortable in your own skin. The easy friendships of elementary school, based on proximity and shared interests in Pokemon cards and playground games, became more complicated as social hierarchies emerged and popularity became a currency I didn't understand how to earn. Still, those foundational years had given me something precious, a deep well of love and creativity that my parents had nurtured without fully understanding, along with the knowledge that there were worlds beyond Columbus, Ohio where different kinds of people could find their place. I didn't know then that the artistic soul they had helped develop would one day become my greatest source of strength during the darkest periods of my life, or that the stories I wrote as a child would teach me how to reshape my own narrative when everything seemed hopeless. Middle school hit me like a freight train carrying all the insecurities, social pressures, and identity crises that define the transition from childhood to adolescence. Lincoln Middle School was a sprawling brick building that seemed designed specifically to make kids feel small and lost, with long corridors that echoed with the sound of slamming lockers and the cruel laughter that teenagers wield like weapons against anyone who dares to be different. The hallways were ruled by an invisible but rigid hierarchy that I struggled to understand, let alone navigate successfully, and I tried desperately to blend into the background while my artistic interests and naturally quiet nature made me an easy target for the bullies who seemed to have radar for detecting vulnerability. I spent lunch periods hiding in the library, eating sandwiches between the stacks while reading fantasy novels that transported me to worlds where outcasts became heroes and magic could solve any problem. The whispers and sideways glances started during my 8th grade year when I didn't show any interest in the spring dance or the girls who passed notes with heart-dotted eyes and wrote their first names next to boys' last names to see how it sounded. Thompson's weird, they'd say in the hallways and locker rooms, and that single word carried implications I wasn't ready to face or even fully understand. I threw myself into extracurricular activities that felt safe, the drama club where emotional expression was encouraged rather than mocked, and the school newspaper where I could be the observer rather than the observed. Mrs. Chen, our drama teacher who had moved to Ohio from San Francisco and brought a worldliness that felt exotic in our small corner of the Midwest, became an unexpected mentor who saw potential in my writing and encouraged me to explore storytelling through different mediums, from short scripts to personal essays that made my classmates uncomfortable with their honesty. High school brought new challenges wrapped in small victories that kept me hopeful about the future. Columbus North High School was larger and more diverse than my middle school, which meant I could find pockets of acceptance among other students who didn't fit the traditional molds of popularity or athletic achievement. I discovered that my writing skills could open doors when I landed a coveted spot on the school newspaper as a sophomore, beating out several upperclassmen for the position. Journalism gave me a legitimate reason to observe people and ask probing questions, skills that would serve me well in my future career, while also providing a protective barrier between myself and the social pressures that seemed to consume my classmates. I interviewed star athletes and honor roll students for feature articles, always the chronicler of other people's achievements rather than the subject of them, comfortable in my role as documenter rather than participant in the drama of high school social life. Dating in high school became a carefully orchestrated performance that required more energy than any school play I had ever been in. I took Sarah Mitchell to junior prom after she asked me when it became clear no one else was going to, and we dated casually for several months in the way that teenagers do when they're trying to figure out how relationships are supposed to work. She was genuinely kind and patient, never pushing for more than innocent kisses after movies at the multiplex or awkward slow dances at school events where we swayed back and forth while trying to make conversation over loud music. I told myself that what I felt for her was love, or at least the beginning of love, but deep down I knew I was acting out a role I thought I was supposed to play rather than expressing authentic feelings. The guilt of lying to such a sweet, trusting girl ate at me like acid, but the alternative, facing the truth about myself and risking everything I had built, seemed impossible in small-town Ohio where being different could cost you everything from friendships to family relationships. My parents noticed my increasing moodiness and attributed it to typical teenage behavior, the kind of angst that all adolescents go through as they figure out who they're going to become. They worried about my grades slipping slightly and my tendency to spend more and more hours alone in my room, either writing increasingly dark and personal stories or browsing the early internet on our family's first computer, a massive desktop that took forever to dial up and connect to the World Wide Web. The internet opened up a whole new world for me, chat rooms and forums where people discussed topics that weren't available in our local library or acceptable at our dinner table conversations, places where I could explore questions about identity and sexuality without anyone knowing who I really was. I spent countless nights reading coming-out stories and articles about gay teenagers, always careful to clear the browser history before anyone else used the computer, desperate for information and community while terrified of being discovered. Senior year brought the mounting pressure of college applications and the tantalizing promise of escape from the fishbowl of high school social dynamics that had defined my teenage years. I had maintained good enough grades despite my emotional struggles to apply to several universities, including Ohio State and some schools in other states that represented freedom, possibility, and the chance to reinvent myself completely. Late at night, I would lie in my twin bed staring at the ceiling with its fading glow-in-the-dark stars, imagining a future where I could shed the carefully constructed persona I had built to survive high school and become someone new and authentic. I dreamed of cities where nobody knew the quiet kid from Columbus, places where I could explore the parts of myself I had kept hidden for so long without fear of judgment or rejection. Little did I know that college would bring its own set of challenges and revelations that would shape the man I was destined to become, or that the journey towards self-acceptance would be far more complicated and rewarding than anything I could imagine from the safety of my childhood bedroom. Ohio State University's campus stretched out before me like a promise of reinvention when I arrived in the fall of 1998, my Honda Civic packed with everything I owned and my heart full of hope for a fresh start. With over 40,000 students from every corner of Ohio and beyond, I could finally disappear into the crowd and figure out who I really was without the watchful eyes of my hometown community or the weight of expectations that had followed me through high school. My dorm room in Bradley Hall became my launching pad into adulthood, complete with a roommate named Kevin who introduced me to late-night pizza runs, the art of productive procrastination, and the revolutionary concept that you could eat cereal for dinner without anyone questioning your choices. For the first time in my life, I felt the intoxicating freedom of making my own decisions about everything from what classes to take to what time to go to bed, and the responsibility was both terrifying and exhilarating in ways I hadn't anticipated. I declared my major in communications with a focus on public relations, drawn to the idea of crafting stories and managing how organizations presented themselves to the world in an age when image and narrative could make or break careers. Professor Williams, who taught my Introduction to Mass Media course with the passion of someone who truly believed in the power of communication to change the world, challenged us to think critically about the messages we consume daily and our responsibility as future professionals to use our skills ethically. Her class opened my eyes to the intricate machinery of public perception and how the stories we tell, whether about companies, political candidates, or social causes, shape the way people think and behave in ways both subtle and profound. I found myself staying after class to discuss the ethical implications of media representation, conversations that would influence my career path and personal philosophy for years to come, teaching me that with great storytelling power comes great responsibility. The social landscape of college was both liberating and terrifying, a complex ecosystem where I could finally explore different aspects of my personality without fear of running into my high school classmates or family friends. Greek life dominated the social scene with its parties and networking opportunities, but I found my true tribe among the students who worked on the campus newspaper, radio station, and literary magazine, the storytellers, observers, and creative misfits who documented campus life rather than just participating in it. Through late-night editing sessions fueled by coffee and passionate debates about journalism ethics, and marathon brainstorming meetings where we tried to capture the essence of student life in compelling articles, I formed friendships based on shared interests and intellectual curiosity rather than social convenience or geographic proximity. These relationships felt more authentic and meaningful than anything I had experienced in high school, built on genuine compatibility rather than survival necessity. It was during my sophomore year, in the spring when the campus came alive with blooming trees and the promise of summer freedom, that I finally admitted to myself what I had been denying for so long with increasing difficulty. There was no dramatic moment of realization, no lightning bolt or movie-worthy epiphany, just a gradual acceptance that grew stronger with each passing day like a flower slowly opening to the sun. I was attracted to men, not women, and no amount of wishful thinking, prayer, or desperate attempts at heterosexual dating would change that fundamental truth about myself that had been there all along, waiting for me to be brave enough to acknowledge it. The admission was simultaneously terrifying and liberating, like taking the first breath after being underwater for too long, or like finally setting down a heavy backpack I had been carrying for miles without realizing how much it was weighing me down. I spent weeks reading everything I could find about sexuality and identity, trying to reconcile this truth with the religious upbringing that had shaped my early worldview and the family expectations I had internalized without question. Coming out to my friends happened in stages, starting with my closest confidant from the newspaper staff, Alex Rodriguez, a journalism major from Toledo who had become my closest friend through shared late nights working on articles and a mutual love of obscure independent films. We were sitting in a 24-hour diner near campus at 2 a.m., ostensibly working on an investigative piece about campus safety but mostly just talking about life in the way that college students do when they're trying to figure out who they're becoming. "I think I'm gay," I whispered across the sticky table, immediately terrified that someone at a nearby booth might have overheard and would somehow report back to my parents or hometown friends. Alex's response was simple and perfect, delivered without missing a beat. "Okay, cool. So what's our headline going to be for this safety article?" His casual acceptance, treating my revelation as just another piece of information about who I was rather than an earth-shattering confession, gave me the courage to be honest with other friends over the following months, most of whom reacted with love, support, and the kind of matter-of-fact acceptance that made me realize how much energy I had been wasting on fear. My parents were a different story entirely, representing the more complicated challenge of maintaining family relationships while living authentically. I chose to tell them during spring break of my junior year, sitting in our familiar living room where I had spent countless hours watching television and doing homework throughout my childhood, surrounded by family photos and the comfortable clutter of middle-class suburban life. The conversation went exactly as poorly as I had imagined it would, with tears from my mother who immediately blamed herself for somehow failing as a parent, accusations from my father about the corrupting influence of college and big city values, and desperate prayers from both of them for God to fix what they saw as a choice rather than an inherent part of who I was. My father's disappointed silence was almost worse than my mother's sobs, and I returned to campus feeling like I had lost my family in exchange for my authenticity, wondering if the price of being true to myself would always be this high. The divide between my college life and my home life became a painful chasm that would take years to bridge, if it ever could be bridged at all, teaching me that sometimes love isn't enough to overcome fundamental differences in worldview and values. Graduating from Ohio State in the spring of 2002 felt like stepping off a cliff into the unknown professional world, armed with nothing but a communications degree and the naive confidence that comes with being 22 years old. The job market was still recovering from the dot-com crash that had devastated the tech industry and sent ripples through the entire economy, making entry-level communications positions scarce and highly competitive among recent graduates who were all fighting for the same opportunities. I moved back in with my parents temporarily, a decision that felt like regression after 4 years of independence and self-discovery, and one that placed me right back into the tension-filled environment I had worked so hard to escape. The atmosphere in our house on Maple Street was thick with unspoken disappointment and awkward attempts at normalcy, as my parents still struggled with my sexuality while I found myself reverting to old patterns of hiding parts of myself to keep the peace during those uncomfortable summer months. My first real job came through a connection from my college advisor, Professor Williams, who had maintained relationships with alumni working throughout the Midwest communications industry. The position was as a junior account executive at Morrison & Associates, a mid-sized public relations firm in Cincinnati that specialized in crisis communications and reputation management for regional businesses and organizations. The salary was modest enough that I had to live on ramen noodles and generic groceries, but the opportunity to work with real clients and develop actual campaigns felt like winning the lottery after months of rejection letters and unreturned phone calls. I found a small studio apartment in the Over-the-Rhine district, a neighborhood that was just beginning its transformation from urban decay to trendy arts destination, and threw myself into city life with the enthusiasm of someone who had been waiting their entire life for this moment of professional independence. The public relations world was fast-paced and demanding, filled with Type A personalities as large and complex as the clients we represented, from Fortune 500 companies dealing with environmental scandals to non-profit organizations trying to raise awareness for overlooked social causes. My boss, Janet Morrison, was a woman who had built her firm from nothing in the male-dominated PR landscape of the 1980s and expected nothing less than excellence from everyone on her team, regardless of their experience level or personal circumstances. She had an uncanny gift for identifying each person's unique strengths and pushing them to excel in those areas while also forcing them to confront their weaknesses head-on, creating an environment that was simultaneously supportive and brutally honest. Under her mentorship, I discovered I had a natural talent for crisis communications and storytelling that could salvage even the most challenging client situations, turning potential disasters into opportunities for organizations to demonstrate their values and commitment to doing better. My writing skills, carefully honed through years of high school journalism and college coursework in everything from creative writing to technical communication, translated perfectly to crafting press releases that actually got media attention and developing communication strategies that resonated with target audiences. I learned to think like a reporter when writing press materials, anticipating the questions journalists would ask and providing them with the information they needed to tell compelling stories about our clients. The work was intellectually challenging in ways I hadn't expected, requiring me to quickly understand complex industries and translate technical information into language that general audiences could understand and care about. Each new client brought a learning curve that kept me engaged and growing professionally, from healthcare systems dealing with malpractice lawsuits to manufacturing companies implementing new environmental standards after decades of pollution concerns. Working in Cincinnati also meant I could finally explore dating without the constant fear of running into high school classmates or family friends who might report back to my parents about my personal life. The city had a small but vibrant LGBTQ+ community centered around a few bars and community organizations, and I cautiously began attending social events and meeting other young professionals who shared similar experiences of coming out in conservative Midwestern environments. My first serious relationship was with Tom Patterson, a high school English teacher who worked in the Cincinnati public school system and understood the challenges of being gay in a profession where you had to be careful about how much of your personal life you revealed to colleagues and students. He was patient with my nervousness about public displays of affection and understood the complicated relationship I maintained with my family back in Columbus, never pressuring me to come out faster than I was comfortable with or to cut ties with relatives who struggled with acceptance. Tom and I dated for nearly 2 years, and through him I learned what it meant to be part of a couple that had to navigate the world with intentionality and awareness that our heterosexual friends took for granted. We couldn't simply hold hands walking down the street without considering our safety and the potential reactions of strangers, and family gatherings meant careful planning about how we would present ourselves and whether we would attend events together or separately. These challenges were completely new to me, having spent most of my 20s focused on building my career rather than building romantic relationships, and Tom taught me that real love required not just emotional connection but also courage and a willingness to advocate for your relationship in a world that didn't always recognize or respect it. He showed me that authenticity was worth the potential risks, and that hiding who you were ultimately hurt both yourself and the people you claimed to love, even when being open felt dangerous or uncomfortable. Portland, Oregon, called to me like a siren song in the summer of 2007, when my relationship with Tom had ended amicably but left me feeling ready for a completely fresh start in a place where I could build a life entirely of my own choosing. The city's reputation for creativity, progressive values, environmental consciousness, and acceptance of all kinds of people made it seem like the perfect place for someone like me who had spent years trying to find where I belonged in the world. I landed a senior account manager position at Greenspeak Communications, a boutique firm specializing in sustainable businesses and nonprofit organizations that were working to address climate change and social justice issues. The cross-country move was both terrifying and exhilarating. Everything I owned fit in my Honda Civic, and I drove west on Interstate 80 with nothing but hope, a carefully curated road trip playlist, and the kind of optimism that comes with believing you're finally moving toward your authentic life. The Pacific Northwest welcomed me with overcast skies, the smell of rain and pine trees, and the promise of reinvention in a place where being different was considered an asset rather than a liability. My new apartment in the Pearl District had exposed brick walls, hardwood floors, and large windows that looked out onto tree-lined streets where people walked their dogs at all hours and rode bicycles to work even in the rain, embodying the kind of environmentally conscious lifestyle I had always admired but never been able to fully embrace in other cities. Portland felt like a city designed specifically for people who thought differently about everything from transportation to food to career success, where tattoo artists were respected as much as lawyers and where everyone seemed to have at least 3 creative hobbies that they pursued with genuine passion. I threw myself into exploring the legendary food scene, hiking trails that led to waterfalls just minutes from downtown, and the professional networking events that would help me build a new career foundation while connecting with like-minded people who cared about using their skills to make the world better. The work at Greenspeak was meaningful in ways my previous jobs hadn't been, helping environmental nonprofits tell their stories effectively and assisting small businesses in communicating their values to consumers who increasingly wanted to support companies that aligned with their personal beliefs. It was at a networking event for communications professionals at a trendy downtown hotel that I first met David Chen, a graphic designer who worked for one of Portland's most respected advertising agencies and had a reputation for creating visually stunning campaigns that actually changed people's behavior around environmental issues. He was presenting a detailed case study about a complete rebranding project for a local coffee roaster that had wanted to better communicate their commitment to fair trade practices and sustainable farming methods, and I was immediately struck by his combination of artistic talent and business acumen, the way he could make complex ethical considerations feel accessible and compelling through design choices. After his presentation, which had been both informative and genuinely entertaining in a way that most professional talks weren't, I approached him with what I hoped was casual confidence to compliment his work and ask some follow-up questions about how he measured the success of campaigns designed to change consumer behavior. Our conversation flowed easily from professional topics to personal interests, covering everything from our favorite Portland restaurants to our shared love of hiking, and before I knew it, we were making plans to meet for coffee the following weekend at a cafe he recommended in the Hawthorne district. David was unlike anyone I had dated before in the best possible ways, confident without being arrogant, creatively ambitious without being pretentious, and genuinely interested in the environmental and social justice work I was doing rather than just politely tolerating my professional passion. He had grown up in San Francisco as the son of immigrants from Taiwan, and had navigated his own complex journey of coming out while balancing family expectations, cultural traditions, and personal authenticity in ways that resonated deeply with my own experiences. Our first few dates involved long afternoons browsing the endless shelves at Powell's Books, exploring the famous food cart pods that served incredible cuisine from every corner of the world, and hours-long conversations about everything from sustainable design practices to our favorite childhood movies to our dreams for the future. The connection was immediate and profound, built on intellectual compatibility, shared values, and a physical attraction that felt natural and easy in ways I had never experienced before with another person. 6 months into our relationship, David and I took our first major trip together, a long weekend in Vancouver, British Columbia, that solidified our bond and helped us envision a shared future that felt both exciting and achievable. We wandered through Stanley Park taking pictures of the massive trees and stunning views of the harbor, ate incredible dim sum in Chinatown while David translated menu items and shared stories about his grandmother's cooking, and stayed up late in our hotel room talking about our deepest dreams and fears with the kind of honesty that only comes when you feel completely safe with another person. It was during this trip that I realized I was falling in love not just with David as an individual, but with the life we were building together and the person I became when I was with him, more confident, more adventurous, more willing to take risks and try new experiences. He brought out aspects of my personality that I had kept hidden for years, encouraging me to be playful and spontaneous in ways that felt revolutionary after a lifetime of carefully controlling my image and managing other people's expectations. By our one-year anniversary, David and I had developed routines and traditions that felt like the foundation of a lasting partnership rather than just a casual dating relationship. Sunday morning trips to the farmer's market became sacred time when we would buy fresh flowers and seasonal produce while planning elaborate meals we would cook together. Friday night cooking experiments turned our kitchen into a laboratory for culinary adventures that didn't always succeed but were always fun. And evening walks along the Willamette River became our opportunity to decompress from work stress and dream out loud about everything from weekend getaway destinations to long-term career goals. David's presence made Portland feel like home in a way I had never experienced before in any city, creating a sense of belonging that went beyond just enjoying where I lived to feeling like I had found the place and the person I was meant to build a life with. When he casually suggested we both get tested for HIV and other sexually transmitted infections before our planned 3-week trip to Europe, a practical suggestion motivated by love, responsibility, and a desire to be completely honest with each other about our health status, I agreed without hesitation, confident that we were simply checking off another item on our journey toward building a life together that was based on trust, communication, and taking care of each other in every possible way. The months following my HIV diagnosis were simultaneously the darkest period of my life and the time when I discovered reserves of inner strength and resilience I never knew I possessed, like finding hidden rooms in a house you thought you knew completely. David's reaction when I told him about my positive status, sitting in our living room with test results trembling in my hands and tears streaming down my face, was everything I had desperately hoped for and feared it wouldn't be. He held me while I cried with the kind of desperate sobs that come from the deepest places of terror and grief, asked practical questions about treatment options and transmission risks with the calm focus of someone committed to facing reality head-on, and never once made me feel like damaged goods or a burden he hadn't signed up for when he fell in love with me. We spent countless hours together researching HIV medications and their side effects, finding the best infectious disease specialists in Portland, and learning about the day-to-day realities of living with the virus in 2015, when treatment had advanced dramatically but stigma remained a persistent challenge. His unwavering support and commitment to our relationship became the foundation upon which I slowly began to rebuild my shattered sense of self-worth and imagine a future that wasn't defined entirely by 3 letters that had initially felt like a death sentence. Starting antiretroviral therapy was a daily reminder of my diagnosis that I initially resented and feared, but Dr. Patel, my infectious disease specialist at OHSU, helped me reframe the medication regimen as a tool of empowerment rather than a symbol of shame or failure. She was a woman in her 50s who had been treating HIV patients since the early days of the epidemic and had watched the transformation from a universally fatal diagnosis to a manageable chronic condition that allowed people to live full, healthy lives. Within 6 months of starting treatment, my viral load became undetectable, meaning the amount of virus in my blood was so low that standard tests couldn't measure it and I couldn't transmit HIV to David or anyone else through sexual contact. The science was clear and reassuring, but the emotional healing took much longer and required a different kind of work that couldn't be accomplished through medication alone. I joined a support group for men living with HIV and found community among people who understood the unique challenges of navigating romantic relationships, family dynamics, and professional environments while managing a condition that still carried enormous stigma in many corners of society. The decision to tell my family about my diagnosis came 2 years later, during a visit home for my sister Emma's wedding, when I realized I couldn't bear the thought of celebrating love and family while carrying such a significant secret that was eating away at my ability to be fully present for important moments. The conversation with my parents took place in the same living room where I had come out to them years earlier, but this time the stakes felt even higher because I was asking them to accept not just who I loved but a medical condition that they associated with death and moral judgment from their conservative worldview. My father, who had struggled with my sexuality for years and was just beginning to soften his stance as he watched David and me build a stable, loving relationship, surprised me by asking thoughtful questions about my health status, treatment options, and prognosis with the kind of genuine concern that put my well-being above his discomfort. My mother cried when I told her, but they were tears of worry and love rather than the tears of shame and disappointment I had feared, and for the first time in years I felt like they were seeing me as their son who needed support rather than as a problem they needed to fix or explain away to their church friends. Professionally, my experience with HIV gave me a deeper understanding of crisis communication, reputation management, and the transformative power of authentic storytelling that resonated with clients and colleagues in ways I hadn't expected. I began specializing in healthcare communications, working with organizations that served marginalized communities and helped them craft messages that reached people who had been overlooked or mistreated by traditional medical systems. My personal experience with navigating complex medical systems, managing stigmatized health conditions, and advocating for myself in clinical settings made me a more empathetic and effective advocate for clients who were dealing with similar challenges in their own work. The strategic thinking, relationship building, and storytelling skills I had developed throughout my career took on new meaning and urgency when applied to causes that directly impacted people like me, giving me a sense of purpose that went beyond simply earning a paycheck or building a professional reputation. I found myself working with HIV service organizations, LGBTQ+ health centers, and nonprofit groups that provided support for people dealing with chronic illnesses, using my communications expertise to help them reach the communities that needed their services most. David and I got married in the summer of 2018, 3 years after my diagnosis, in a ceremony that felt like a celebration of not just our love but our resilience and commitment to building a life together despite the challenges we had faced. The wedding was held in the Rose Garden at Peninsula Park, surrounded by chosen family from Portland's LGBTQ+ community and blood relatives who had traveled from across the country to support us, including my parents who had made the difficult but meaningful decision to embrace our relationship publicly. We exchanged vows we had written ourselves, with readings from poets like Maya Angelou and Rumi who had written about love transcending all obstacles and the courage required to live authentically in a world that often punishes difference. As we kissed for the first time as married partners while our friends and family cheered around us, I thought about the incredible journey that had brought us to this moment, from the scared kid in Columbus who thought he was fundamentally broken, to the man standing in a garden in Portland celebrating authentic love with someone who knew every part of his story and had chosen to build a future together anyway. Today, in 2024, 9 years after that terrifying Tuesday morning in Dr. Martinez's office that changed everything, I live with HIV the way other people live with diabetes, high blood pressure, or any other chronic condition that requires daily attention but doesn't define their worth or limit their dreams in meaningful ways. David and I have traveled to dozens of countries together, from the backpacking trip through Southeast Asia we took for our honeymoon to the African safari we splurged on for our 5th wedding anniversary, proving to ourselves that HIV wouldn't stop us from experiencing everything the world had to offer. We bought a house in the Alberta Arts District with a big backyard where we grow vegetables and herbs that supply our weekend cooking adventures, and we've built careers that fulfill us professionally while also contributing to causes we care deeply about. I volunteer regularly with newly diagnosed individuals through the Cascade AIDS Project, sharing my story to help them understand that an HIV diagnosis is not the end of their story but rather a chapter that can lead to deeper self-acceptance, more meaningful relationships, and a clearer sense of what really matters in life. The work I do now, both professionally and as a volunteer, involves helping people understand that resilience isn't about avoiding difficulties but about discovering who you become when you face them with courage, community support, and a willingness to keep growing even when the path forward isn't clear. HIV taught me that authenticity requires ongoing courage rather than a single moment of bravery, that love deepens when it's tested by real challenges rather than just celebrated during easy times, and that some of life's most profound gifts come disguised as devastating losses that force you to rebuild yourself stronger and more honest than before. The scared 28-year-old who sat in that doctor's office couldn't have imagined that the virus he feared would destroy his life would actually teach him how to live more fully, love more fearlessly, and find purpose in helping others navigate their own difficult journeys toward acceptance and healing. Life, I learned through the hardest possible lessons, isn't about avoiding pain and uncertainty but about discovering the strength and compassion that emerge when you stop running from your story and start embracing every part of who you are, including the parts that scare you most.